Karen started screaming that another woman had stolen her first-class seat. She refused to back down, what no one knew. I was watching the whole thing, and I was the one person who could change everything. Oh, before we dive into this wild flight, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And hey, if you enjoy real stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe. The engines hadn't even started yet when I felt it. That shift in energy you only get when someone's about to cause a scene. It started with an exaggerated sigh, loud and deliberate, like the kind a child makes when they want attention without saying a word. Then came the sharp rhythm of high heels striking the cabin floor with more purpose than necessary. I glanced up just in time to see her storming through the aisle, early 50s, crisp blazer, platinum hair that didn't move when she did, the kind of woman who made herself known before even opening her mouth. She stopped 2 rows ahead of me, seat 2A. A woman was already sitting there, tucked quietly by the window, reading a paperback. Peaceful, relaxed. That wouldn't last long. "You're in my seat," the blonde woman snapped. The woman in the seat looked up, blinking like she wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. "Sorry?" I said. The other woman repeated louder this time. "You're in my seat. 2A, first class." The reader didn't argue. She just reached into her tote bag, pulled out her boarding pass, and offered it with a calm nod. Graceful. I liked that. Not a scene maker, just someone trying to get from point A to point B in peace. But the other woman barely glanced at the ticket before scoffing. "You must have made a mistake," she said flatly. The reader tilted her head slightly, her voice still even. I double-checked before boarding. The air got tighter, not hotter, just heavier, like pressure building in a balloon. Around me, other passengers began tuning in, casually pretending to scroll through their phones, while they leaned just slightly toward the commotion. We all know a Karen when we see one. She's not always named Karen, but you know her. Loud, always right, and allergic to being told no. This one was textbook. She turned her attention to the aisle, catching the eye of a flight attendant walking past. "Excuse me," she called out with exaggerated urgency. "This woman is sitting in my seat, and I need this resolved now." The flight attendant smiled with professional calm, but I could see the way her fingers tightened slightly on the tablet in her hand. She was already bracing for impact. "May I see both of your boarding passes, please?" The woman in 2A handed hers over immediately, like someone who knew she had nothing to hide. The blonde hesitated for a half-second, then finally passed hers over too. The attendant looked at both, then paused. "Ma'am," she said, turning to the quiet woman, "you are in the correct seat." Then to the other, "Your seat is 12B in economy." It was the kind of moment where you could hear every breath in the cabin, but the woman didn't back down. She let out a disbelieving laugh. "That can't be right. I always fly first class. This is my seat. There has to be a mistake. I'm sorry, ma'am, but the ticket says 12B. And then, without missing a beat, the blonde declared, "Well, I need to sit here. I have a condition." Of course she did. And somehow, I already knew this was just getting started. Her voice rose the way steam hisses before a kettle screams. "I always sit here," the woman snapped, folding her arms in front of her designer handbag like it was a courtroom podium. There has clearly been a mix-up. The flight attendant stayed calm, as if she'd done this dance before. "Ma'am, your ticket says 12B. That's in our economy section. But I always fly first class." "Always." "Check again." Her tone had sharpened into something colder now, less confused and more accusatory. Her eyes darted to the woman still seated by the window, still quiet, still composed, and narrowed, as if she were to blame for the entire situation. "I don't know how she got my seat, but someone needs to do something." No one moved. The quiet woman, still unnamed to me at this point, simply looked down at her book again, fingers gently resting on the open pages. A few passengers around us had now completely tuned in. Phones weren't out yet, but expressions had shifted. That shared passenger language of, "Oh boy, here we go." Karen stepped forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make it sound like she was being reasonable, when really she was just doubling down. Look, this is probably just a little mix-up. Maybe someone entered the wrong info at the desk. I'm sure you can bump her somewhere else. I need this seat. My husband's a VIP with this airline. There it was, the husband card, the implied power, the unspoken, I matter more than she does. The flight attendant's smile didn't falter. We can't reassign paid seats without cause. And again, your ticket is clearly marked for economy. The woman's jaw clenched. Do you know who my husband is? I don't, ma'am, the attendant said evenly. But unless he's the one flying today, his status doesn't affect your assigned seating. The woman laughed again, short, sharp, disbelieving. This is unacceptable. Completely unacceptable. I watched the muscles in her neck tighten as she scanned the cabin, perhaps hoping for an ally. Someone who might speak up and say, yes, this is outrageous. How dare they put someone like you in coach? But all she got were stares. Polite, silent stares. The woman in the seat, unflinching, unreadable, still said nothing. That somehow was what made the moment even better. She didn't raise her voice, didn't try to argue. Just let the storm swirl around her, like she'd seen enough of the world to know how these things usually end. And she was right, though not even she could have known how this one would end. Karen wasn't just doubling down. She was going for the full performance now. She sighed dramatically, pressing a hand to her chest like a soap opera star on the verge of fainting. I'm not feeling well, she said loudly. My blood pressure. I have a condition. I need to sit here for medical reasons. The flight attendant didn't blink. Ma'am, if you have a medical condition that requires a specific seating, you need to inform the airline ahead of time. That information would be in your booking profile. Karen looked personally offended by the request for facts. Oh, so now you're questioning my health? Do I need to get my doctor on the phone? I mean, really, is this how you treat loyal customers? The woman in the seat hadn't moved. She looked up briefly, still calm, still unbothered, and offered the kind of half shrug that says, I'm not moving, but I also won't waste my energy fighting you. Karen didn't like that, not one bit. She spun to face her. Listen, I'm giving you a chance to do the right thing here. You don't look like someone who needs this seat. You seem fine. Just be decent and switch with me. You have no idea what I've been through today. The woman, whose name I still didn't know, though she carried herself like someone who'd walked through storms before, met Karen's eyes and replied quietly, No, I think I'll stay where I am. That did it? Karen's voice went up an octave. Unbelievable, she screeched. The selfishness on this flight is unreal. This is what happens when people don't respect class boundaries. Class boundaries. She actually said it. That was the moment things turned. I could hear it. Shifts in breath, little gasps, the unmistakable rustle of smartphones being pulled from seat pockets. One man across the aisle pretended to adjust his tray table while angling his phone camera just right. Another 2 rows up tilted their heads in interest. It was clear the entire cabin was now tuned in. Karen wasn't just embarrassing herself anymore. She was making a spectacle of it. I swear, she continued, pacing in the aisle now, my husband is going to have words with this airline. This entire situation is disgraceful. I am being discriminated against. This is a violation of my rights. The flight attendant stepped forward. Ma'am, you need to lower your voice. Karen spun toward her. I am the victim here. You're letting this woman, this nobody, take my seat while I'm forced to suffer back there in a middle row next to some sweaty man eating peanuts. Her words hung in the air like a bad smell, and still the woman in the seat didn't flinch. And neither did I. Not yet. By now the cabin wasn't just tense, it was practically humming with secondhand embarrassment. The kind of silence that comes when 100 people all collectively decide someone really ought to say something. Karen was still ranting, still refusing to move. And the woman in 2A hadn't said another word. She didn't need to. Her restraint had become its own kind of power. That's when I took off my headphones. I'd stayed quiet long enough, not out of fear, but because I wanted to see how far this would go. Sometimes people like Karen expose themselves best when you let them keep talking. But now the atmosphere had turned from awkward to hostile, and the flight crew looked like they were 3 seconds away from calling security. Enough was enough. I stood up slowly. "Excuse me," I said, not loud, not aggressive, just steady enough that heads turned. Karen paused mid-sentence and stared at me like I'd interrupted her monologue. "I don't mean to intrude," I continued, "but I think it might be helpful if I speak to the situation just for a moment." The lead flight attendant turned toward me, brow furrowed slightly. "Sir, is there something you'd like to add?" I nodded. "Yes, but I'd like to speak to you and your team for a moment, privately if possible." She glanced at the other flight attendant. "We can step into the galley." Karen scoffed loudly. "Oh, great. Now we've got another passenger trying to play hero. What's next? A group vote on who deserves the seat?" I ignored her completely. I wasn't speaking for attention. I was speaking because the person who needed to speak hadn't yet. Me. As I stepped into the small galley with the 2 flight attendants, I lowered my voice and gave them my full name, followed by my role. Their eyes widened. "Oh," one of them said, "you're—" I gave a small nod. "That's right. I'm not here to make a scene, but I think it's time I speak to the situation directly, if that's all right with you." They looked at each other, then back at me. The lead attendant smiled, almost visibly relieved. "Please be our guest." We returned to the cabin. Karen was still standing in the aisle, arms crossed, eyes rolling with Olympic-level intensity. I stepped forward, just enough to be clearly seen by her and everyone else in first class. "I think we've let this go on long enough," I said calmly, evenly. "There's a reason none of this is working out the way you expected, and I think it's time you understood why." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I'm the CEO of this airline," I said, meeting Karen's eyes directly, "and I've been watching this unfold since you stepped on board." The effect was instant. Karen's jaw slackened, but no words came out. Her posture faltered for the first time since she began her crusade. Even her perfectly sculpted hair seemed to lose its bravado. She blinked at me like her brain was still buffering the information. I heard a soft gasp from the woman in 2A, Lisa, I'd soon learn, but she said nothing, just sat up a little straighter, her book forgotten on her lap. Around us, the cabin was still, completely, almost eerily quiet. The same passengers who had just moments ago been watching the drama like a reality show were now frozen in suspense, their eyes bouncing between Karen and me. Karen opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. You're kidding," she finally said, voice faltering. You don't look like—" "I don't need to," I replied simply. "You've spent the last 10 minutes berating another passenger, ignoring flight crew instructions, faking a medical condition, and making vague threats while shouting about class boundaries. That's not just disruptive. That's a violation of airline policy and, in some cases, federal regulations." Her face drained of color. She took a small step back, like the weight of it had finally landed. "I wasn't threatening anyone," she muttered, trying to recover. I was upset. I mean, this is a very expensive ticket, and there must have been a system error." "There was no error," I said. "Your ticket clearly states 12B. You're assigned to economy. You were given that seat because that's what you, or your husband, or whoever booked it, paid for." Karen shook her head weakly, as if trying to pretend the situation could still be reversed. "I just thought there was a mistake." I turned to the flight attendants. "Are there any open seats in first class?" They both shook their heads. "Fully booked, sir." I looked back at Karen. "Then I'm afraid there are 2 options here. You can take your assigned seat in 12B, or we can deplane you." It was quiet again, except now it wasn't suspense. It was resolution. Karen blinked rapidly, lips parting like she wanted to scream or cry or both, but no sound came out. She looked around the cabin, hoping someone, anyone, would step in and save her. No one moved. The silence was unanimous. Karen tried to smile, but it barely held together. It was the kind of smile people wear when they've just realized they've made a terrible mistake, but are still hoping they can bluff their way through it. "I didn't know," she said quickly, her voice shaky. "Nobody told me. I wasn't trying to cause a scene. I just thought maybe the system had glitched or something." I didn't respond right away. I just let the silence settle between us, the kind of silence that demands truth. The cabin still hadn't moved. Every passenger was locked into the moment like they were watching the finale of a show they hadn't meant to get invested in. "You've had every opportunity to correct this calmly," I said, "but instead, you made a scene, disrespected our staff, harassed another passenger, and disrupted the entire cabin. Now you have a decision to make." Her eyes flicked toward the flight attendants. Nothing but calm professionalism there. "You can take your assigned seat in 12B, I continued, "or we'll have to remove you from the flight. The choice is entirely yours." Karen's mouth opened slightly like she might protest again, but nothing came out. She turned back to look at the woman in 2A, Lisa, and for a moment there was a flash of something almost like regret, but it passed quickly, replaced by the tightness in her jaw and a slight trembling in her fingers. Without another word, she reached for her carry-on, yanked it from the overhead compartment with a little more force than necessary, and turned sharply toward the back of the plane. The only sound that followed her down the aisle was the hard, echoing click of her heels against the floor. Less confident now, more like punctuation marks on her retreat. Passengers watched her go, some with small, satisfied smiles. Others simply relieved the air was finally clearing. I stayed where I was, standing quietly until she disappeared behind the curtain separating first class from economy. The flight attendant nearest me exhaled just slightly. "Thank you, sir." I gave a small nod. "Let's continue boarding." As I returned to my seat, I passed the woman in 2A. She looked up, her eyes searching mine, and for the first time she spoke directly to me. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," I said softly, settling back into my seat. "You handled that better than most would have." She smiled, genuinely this time, and returned to her book. And just like that, peace returned to the cabin. Well, for a while. The shift in the cabin was immediate. You could feel it like a pressure valve releasing. Shoulders dropped. Conversations started back up in hushed tones. The tension that had gripped every row like a vice had finally loosened, replaced by a collective exhale and the quiet buzz of relief. A flight attendant made her way down the aisle, offering drinks. When she reached me, she handed over a glass of champagne with the kind of warm smile that said, "Thank you for saving us from a very long flight." I nodded, took the glass, and leaned back into my seat. Lisa, still in 2A, turned to me again, not loudly, just a soft voice beneath the hum of the engines. "I meant it. Thank you." I offered a small smile. "You didn't need me. You handled yourself with grace." She gave a quiet laugh. "I was holding on by a thread." "A strong one," I said. She turned back to her book and I took a sip of champagne. Smooth, cold, the kind of quiet moment you earn. First class settled into its rhythm, the clinking of ice in glasses, the shuffle of pages, the soft ding of a seatbelt light turning off. Peace finally. Order restored. Until it wasn't. Roughly halfway through the flight, a voice pierced the cabin from somewhere deep in the economy section. "I want to speak to the pilot." It was unmistakable. The same shrill tone, the same cadence, and somehow, even from several rows back and through the curtain, I knew exactly who it was. A few passengers around me turned slowly in their seats, heads tilting like they couldn't believe it either. "I am not being treated fairly," the voice cried. "This is discrimination." The flight attendant beside me didn't flinch. She just glanced at me with a look that blended exhaustion with the faintest trace of amusement. "Would you like me to handle it?" she whispered. I smiled, swirling the champagne in my glass. "No need. I think she's already said enough for one day." More murmurs rippled through the cabin. People weren't tense anymore. They were entertained. One man across the aisle actually chuckled and said under his breath, "Didn't she learn the first time?" Apparently not. The shouting died down eventually, likely met with another firm but patient conversation from the back crew. No one was removed this time, but the lesson? Still very much incomplete. Some people learn through humility, others through silence. But then there are those like her, the ones who never learn because they're too busy trying to win battles no one else is fighting. I took another sip of champagne and let the hum of the engines drown out the last of her noise. At 35,000 feet, silence really is golden. Looking back, it's wild how quickly a simple flight turned into a full-blown social experiment at 35,000 feet. One person's entitlement nearly derailed the peace of an entire cabin, and all over a seat that wasn't even hers. What stuck with me most wasn't the shouting or the drama. It was the calm, the way the real strength came from silence, patience, and not stooping to her level. Lisa never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her dignity spoke for her. Karen thought she could control the situation by being the loudest in the room. But in the end, the quiet truths, printed clearly on our tickets and written all over her behavior, spoke louder than anything she could scream. And yet, I wonder, what would you have done in that moment? If you were Lisa, calmly being attacked in public, or me, watching it unfold, waiting for the right time to step in? Would you have stayed quiet, spoken up sooner? Let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how you would have handled a Karen at 35,000 feet. And hey, if you ever do run into someone like her, keep your cool. Your silence might be the loudest thing in the room.